Welcome to the Workplace Wellbeing Essential Series. I'm Mari Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Advancing Wellness. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this expert interview where we explore topics that impact employee well-being. My guests today are Lisa Desai and Bryan Kohl of MindWise Innovations. Lisa is the director of MindWise Screening Program and Research. She's a licensed psychologist and a behavioral health professional with 20 years of clinical, management, and consulting experience. Through her work at MindWise Innovations, she helps companies prioritize effective and sustainable behavioral health strategies through the business development, design, implementation, and evaluation of mental health and substance misuse programs. Lisa lives in the Boston area with her husband, 2 daughters, and a beloved black lab. She is of South Asian descent and enjoys all things social. Bryan is the Senior Vice President at MindWise Innovations, and Bryan has over 20 years as a technology professional who has spent his career working with startups and large organizations such as Bose Corporation and Dell Technologies. Now as the Senior Vice President of MindWise Innovations, Bryan leads all strategic and organizational development efforts, prioritizing the innovation of educational technologies and the digital transformation of all behavior health programs. Outside of work, you can find Bryan playing the drums, spending time with friends, reading, running, or in most winters, but not this one, skiing.
Yeah.
So Bryan and Lisa, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, our pleasure,
Thank
Mari.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great. Well, mental well-being is our topic for today, and this has increasingly become a much more visible topic in the workplace. Now that we're in the midst of the worldwide coronavirus, it is even more the case that we need to be concerned about mental well-being. What we've seen in the crumbling is the crumbling of the Maslow pyramid. So no longer are we worried about self-actualization. We're worried about those things at the base of the pyramid, like food and financial well-being and safety. So our worldview and our personal views have really changed dramatically in a very short period of time. And at that base level, we're really thinking about the ways in which this virus is having an impact on the emotional well-being of people. Everybody's feeling, and none of us are really exempt from this. We're feeling fear, we're vulnerable, we're feeling helplessness. There's a whole wide array of emotions that are at play today. So let's explore this emotional impact of the coronavirus and how employers can support their workforce through this. So how do we think, let's talk at first, like how is this crisis impacting people? What's the emotional toll that it's taking?
Well, Mari, as you said, it's really upended what we think of as normal, and people are talking about the new normal. When you mentioned Maslow, those basic needs, physiological and safety, have to do with food, shelter, having a job, clothing, and so forth, and things that we really take for granted.
Right.
So what's happened is not only has it impacted the workforce, it's impacted the family, the spouses. And developmentally, based on where you are, whether you're a child, a teenager, college student, adult, your behaviors, your reactions are going to differ. So what the breakdown, the upending looks like in a working woman, a working spouse, a child looks very different. So, I think one of the things we think about, and it's becoming very clear, is employers need to stay connected with their employees. Whether they are delivering unfortunate news, like furloughs, whether they are thinking and reimagining how teams can work more productively. You mentioned earlier, before we started this, remote working, that's taken on a whole new meaning. And how can employers support that? How can they provide behavioral health information and really have a door open policy of being able to reach out and say, I'm not doing well, what can I do?
Right.
Mari, it's when we think about it from an organizational development perspective, it's challenged every structure we've ever known, from org charts to how teams are structured to to what it even means now to be a high-performing team. So yeah, the physiological, the safety, that sense of belonging is critical. So regardless of how your organization was structured, you've got to maintain that sense, that semblance of belonging, and very quickly look to determine how you're going to redefine what it means to be a team, what it means to be a high-performing team, because every assumption we've made has been challenged.
Right.
So much so. Yeah, it really is. So let's talk a little bit about what can employers do to support their employees. This is a really critical time for employers to really step up and recognize that to keep their people strong and productive and engaged and loyal, they're going to really need to, be able to support their workforce. So what are your thoughts about how employers can do that?
Yeah, Mari, you used a word earlier that we use an awful lot internally called vulnerability.
Yes.
We're all feeling a little vulnerable right now, but we're not powerless. And what do we mean by that? Well, when we think about just basic leadership models, maybe it's servant leadership, for example, demonstrating, exhibiting, not being afraid to demonstrate that vulnerability in front of your team is critical, more now than ever. And what that then begins to do, and our friend Amy Edmondson at Harvard can speak to this wonderfully, but what it then begins to do is inculcate this psychological safety. So as a leader, as a manager, as a team member, demonstrate that vulnerability. Don't be afraid to put it out there. How do you do that? You do that in your daily conversations. You do that in your huddles. You do that in your team meetings, wherever. That's the first thing. Don't be afraid to talk and or exhibit that vulnerability, because quite honestly, we're all feeling it right now.
All feeling it. Right. Yep, exactly. We are all in the same boat. We're big believers in tools and providing information and tools to people because it helps coping. So, we have a team, an incredibly talented, seasoned team at Riverside Trauma Center, which is connected, part of MindWise. And they put together a framework that has been unbelievably helpful in this situation that we're facing, the pandemic, and particularly in the workforce. And in their framework is safety, predictability, and control. So just very briefly to review that, we have information that we can provide to your audience to follow up with later. But so, if you think about, again, going back to Maslow's, what is ended in our lives? It's the core aspect of feeling stable. So safety aspect is there's a lot of talk about keeping a social distance, washing our hands, wearing masks if we have them. So there are physical ways we can stay safe, but we're not necessarily hearing as much yet, hopefully we will, about what do we need to do to stay emotionally safe. And what that means is staying connected to one another. I think people are getting very creative about using it to stay connected socially. Kids are using it to stay connected. I think I reconnected with college friends that I hadn't talked to forever over this. So I think there's staying socially connected. There's the emotional safety of what do I turn to in healthy kind of coping ways? Is it walking? Is it exercising? Yoga? Is it artistic? What do I do that makes me feel emotionally grounded? So that's kind of the safety piece. The predictability is out the window and control is out the window for us in the face of this pandemic. But we have to remember, as Bryan says, we're not helpless. We can think about small ways in our daily life that we can build in a schedule. So predictability is about routine. It's about rituals, however you want to think about it. It may be adapting a schedule to this working from home and everyone's home. So there are going to be different schedules, encouraging family members to have a schedule. As an example, my older daughter's home from college, and she said the other day when she was walking from her bedroom to the study room where she was going to an online class, she said, "I'm going to class now." And I think it was a joke, but I think there's a way in which it was marking that I can't walk across campus, but I'm walking from my room to this study area where I'm going to log on to a class. So I think ways that we can build that kind of scheduling is key. And then the control is, how can we collaborate around decision making? Whether it is with your team, whether it is with your folks at home, And with team members, how do you problem solve? So, the way that you led meetings, the way that you organized around a task 3 months ago is going to be very different than now. And how do you enable every person on that team to feel a sense of control and to use their talents? We often forget what our skills, what our talents, what we really gravitate to. And this is the time to really bring that up and brush it off, shine it up, and use it.
That's great. Bryan, some things you want to add?
Yeah, Mari, Lisa knows me as the silver lining guy. Look, things aren't, they're awfully difficult right now and dire for tens of thousands of people across the country. But when I think about where we could be, where we might be in 12, 18 months from now, I think back to conversations we had throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s around, Edward Deming saying, drive out fear from the organization. And then as we referenced Amy Edmondson earlier around psychological safety and some of the work that Google did to better understand what goes into high-performing teams, what we're really saying is that this idea of checking your baggage at the door, forgive the expression, but this idea of checking your baggage at the door no longer exists. It can't exist because we are a whole self, and it's forcing organizations. It's forcing organizations of any size, any makeup, to really think what it is needs to be embedded in their culture. And it's these kinds of conversations. It's that vulnerability. It's the safety. It's the predictability. It's the control that Lisa just referenced. It's this overarching idea that no matter who we are, we should never, ever, ever be concerned about speaking our ideas, talking about our concerns, asking questions, checking assumptions. So forgive the silver lining, but I'm incredibly optimistic about what this will mean for organizations moving forward, specifically the culture that they're trying to engender or will need to engender moving forward.
Well,
go ahead, Lisa.
Bryan and I were preparing for this. I said to Bryan, I wonder, it'll be interesting to see the research that comes out of this in terms of working from home, working remotely, because there is often this, in some ways, a myth that when you're working from home, you're not as productive. So I thought, I wonder what that research will look like. And Bryan, of course, knows of research.
We know of some research that's been done by various organizations, large organizations that have come to the realization that, hey, solely remote teams in some cases can be more productive. And as a result, potentially reducing the number of days that are expected during the week. So we'll see how that unfolds moving forward. The one thing we've got to be aware of, though, is that digital virtual fatigue. Forgive me, those are our words.
Yes.
But this idea of virtual fatigue, look, staring into a camera and really being focused on this conversation is a different level of exhaustion than we might experience when we're, say, in a boardroom. So please, we ask everyone to be cognizant of that virtual fatigue. And as we say, ditch the computer every now and again and hop on your phone or go for a walk. Just basic things, but be cognizant of the fact that we're all experiencing this virtual fatigue. And we need to think about ways to mitigate that fatigue, whether it's, again, just a simple walk around the block or what have you.
Well, it sounds like we're really asking leaders and managers to really adopt a new mindset, if you will, around flexibility, to be more empathetic, to be more compassionate, to lighten up a little, to, really be able to make sure that, we're all going through this together and we have to support each other in this. And while productivity is important, it can't be viewed as everything.
Although when leaders are empathic and when they're connected and when they're flexible, it will likely result in a more productive workforce. So it's a win-win in that way. It's part of that psychological safety.
Yeah, so much.
I think and it was leave it to Google, but it was Google that I think came to that conclusion through their Project Aristotle, that said exactly that, through increased empowerment, by really, really establishing the trust needed to build these high-performing teams. In the end, it was all about making sure that that environment was comprised or had or psychological safety existed within those environments.
Yeah, absolutely.
We do a lot of work in across a number of sectors, and sometimes we like to think about the physical safety that exists within our day-to-day. Take, for example, construction industry or even manufacturing. There's that physical safety, but it really is awfully important for those organizations to start thinking about the psychological. Mm-hmm. Our expression is, it's one thing to know what's happening outside the hard hat. It's another thing to know what's happening inside the hard hat. Mm-hmm. And we find moments like now where organizations are really, really, really grasping, trying to understand that and making a difference.
All good.
And Mari, to address that question of what can employers do, we also think about it in terms of the short term and the long term. So we're in crisis response mode right now with organizations as a globe, but also in organizations. It's also in phase 2, so to speak, in terms of looking at the long term. What employers can do is really think about how can they build in the well-being, the behavioral health, awareness, and the tools to have conversations. A lot of what we hear when we're working with corporations and employees in corporations is an appetite and a willingness and a desire to talk about behavioral health, to talk about depression, anxiety, substance misuse, stress, burnout, to talk about how do I manage, 200 emails an hour. So there's a desire to talk about it, but not the comfort level, because of stigma, because we're not used to talking about behavioral health very much at all, let alone in the workplace. There's what we've learned is providing the language to talk about, and in kind of, I think of it as Psych 101, Organizational 101, blended together. What's depression look like? What's anxiety look like? How do you know? How does it show up at work? How can managers address it if they notice it in an empathic, caring, connected way? And then optimally, how can eventually that lead to kind of our mantra, so to speak, is early identification, early access to treatment, better outcome. So how can, that is a long-term way in which employers can really tackle this so it's sustainable.
Those are great suggestions. And, I think about this from the perspective of, where we're headed. We're in the midst of this slow motion trauma. And we don't know when it's going to end, which is part of the agonizing part of it. We just, every day feels like a week and it just keeps going. And I'm just curious as to, there's going to be so much to learn, as you say, as we come out of this and think about what the world is going to look like or how we want the world to look, which is the way I prefer to think about it, is that we do have some control over this, but that we're prepared for what comes, once the worst of this is behind us. And whether we need to be thinking about this from a trauma response perspective. I mean, certainly in the healthcare industry and in hospitals, that is going to be the case. There's certainly going to be some, post-traumatic stress aspects that are going to need to be addressed. But we need to be conscious of that, I think, for all employees. And, we've got a whole, group of people who are now unemployed and, have job insecurity. They don't know if they're going to have jobs. So what are your thoughts about how to look out a little bit and see where we're headed with this and what our response is going to need to be?
Forgive some of the business jargon, but one thing that we know is when someone doesn't show up to work, they're absent, they don't show up to work. For those that show up to work but aren't there, they're kind of checked out. The expression we use is presenteeism. And I think what we're already seeing is increased rates of presenteeism. And presenteeism leads to distractions, leads to lack of productivity, both for the organization and for the individual. The reason I bring that up is you can see absenteeism, you can see presenteeism. You know when someone isn't fully there, they're checked out. What that necessitates within any organization is, as Lisa pointed out earlier, the language. We have to know how to talk about this stuff. We have to know what it is we're observing across the organization in and out of our teams. So 101 is let's have the conversation. Let's learn the language. Let's learn what it looks like, presenteeism, and absenteeism to a certain extent. It's got to start with the language. There are other things that we can layer on, as we're seeing as best practices. There are other things we can layer on, tools and additional training and programs, but starting with understanding the language, how to talk about this stuff is critical. Lisa?
So important.
Yeah, and I can't help but, when you were talking about trauma and PTSD, so much, again, what the information I pulled from earlier, SPC, it was developed by our Riverside trauma team. And they are unbelievable in terms of their knowledge and the way they think about this is, and they're preparing already, with virtual learnings, virtual trainings, to put information out to communities, to workplaces, to schools around how are we going to cope with this? This is a new level of collective trauma, if you will, that we're experiencing. And if you think about people in the workforce that already have pre-existing traumas and in some in the clinical world and in that area of expertise would say we all come to the world with and during the course of our life, we all have some level of trauma. For those who have experienced a specific or chronic or acute trauma, this is layered upon that. So it becomes complicated. So having the ability to, for employers and for corporations to recognize this and to have resources like Riverside Trauma Center and like other resources that are out there to really provide education. And I would say normalize this, rather than
That's the word.
You're an outlier for needing help. Bryan and I were talking yesterday, and one outcome of this that may be oddly positive is help seeking may not be so taboo. It may not be a weakness to seek help. And again, much of what we encourage is for people to early identify, I'm struggling, and to be able to reach out. If you've got a toothache, you're going to reach out to the dentist. You're not going to think about it. You're not going to think, oh my God, I need Novocaine. That's not okay. I've got a toothache. I shouldn't ask for help. But we do that around mental illness and substance misuse. So again, I wonder about if it'll be a little easier, because there could be all different, it's always been executives, all levels of employment have needed, whether it's executive coaching, whether it's therapy, there may be a lot more empathy around reaching out.
Well, I really hope you're right, because I think this is something that we certainly need. And while there are plenty of resources that are available, we often know, we look at things like EAP services that are, while in many large organizations, those are available, that very small percentage, single digit percentage of employees actually take advantage of those services. So I really hope you're right that it will become much more of the norm for people to seek help. Bryan, any other thoughts on that?
No, other than I think I loved your question and how you phrased the question. What are we hoping for? What do we see coming? And I think normalizing is a really, really important word. I think another important word is operationalizing. Again, forgive the business jargon, but we need to make sure that this is more than just a training program, that this is more of just yet another thing that we all have to go through from a compliance perspective. I think what we're learning is that this conversation, this psychological safety, if you don't mind my reusing the expression, that this is ultimately what will drive organizations moving forward. That's what I think is happening, and figuring out how to operationalize that, whether that's in your morning huddles, your team meetings, the kinds of conversations you're asking in those huddles and team meetings. That's what we're starting to see take effect. So hopeful. We kind of have no choice. We got to figure this out, don't we, Mari?
Right.
We got to figure this out. But anyway.
And we will figure this out. Yeah, this is great. So Lisa and Bryan, if our audience wants to learn more about you and the work that you're doing at MindWise Innovations, where can they find you?
Oh, it's simple. MindWise.org. MindWise.org. Keep in mind that we are a division of a very large nonprofit called Riverside Community Care.
So you've got a lot of resources available there for people to be able to take advantage of.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Lots of expertise around all kinds of clinical realms.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for being here today. As always, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Mari, thank you very
so
much
for inviting us.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you.